is Investor Ideas at Globe 2016, a leadership summit on sustainable business. In this session, you'll hear all about water integrity, infrastructure, and innovation. Two key topics, water scarcity and water security.
So, in many places, most of the places I've worked around the world, people are using water unsustainably. So our groundwater levels are decreasing, rivers are drying up, wetlands disappearing. We do see increasing competition for water. And that can take place within a community. So Saskatchewan is, at the moment, discussing, does it put more water into agriculture? What does that do to availability for mining development? And then there are issues between upstream and downstream users, which might be the fact that Saskatchewan gets most of its water from Alberta, or it might be the fact that Pakistan is downstream of India on the Indus. And there are tensions around these competing uses. And then the third factor, the water quality factor, which we must remember. Generally speaking, we're seeing degradation of water quality. And in most developed countries, it's not really the gross pollution that's coming out of pipes, because we can see that and we can measure that. It's actually the diffuse pollution from the fact that we're putting too many nutrients in our systems. And then we're also seeing more people and more assets at risk from the extremes of flood and drought. So there's a whole set of challenges which are playing out right now, but if we look into the future, then those challenges are going to get more severe. We have more people, they will want to use more water, they need more food, they need more energy, they'll have expectations of richer diets in terms of water-rich foods, water-consuming foods. And then the environment is not stationary. The environment is changing. We are changing the land, and we're changing the way in which we manage the water. So many of the world's major rivers are not natural anymore. And then we've also got this backdrop of climate change. And climate change is really playing out in a very important way in Canada at the moment. And there are interesting feedbacks, because of course coming to British Columbia, and some of you will have been at the talk yesterday talking about forest decline in British Columbia. I mean, the impact of bark beetle in British Columbia has been an immense land use impact, partly induced by climate change. So there's a whole set of challenges to face up with. And as we've already heard, the statistics are that we may have 6 billion people living in water-scarce areas in just a few decades' time. So I think that most Canadians think that applies to the rest of the world, and it doesn't apply to us because we've got lots of water. And Canada, of course, is one of the world's most water-rich countries, but that doesn't mean to say that it doesn't have all the problems I've just been talking about, because water is actually, although it's global and though it's regional, it's a very local, has a very local set of issues. So I'm just going to run through the Saskatchewan River Basin, my home basin. It's because it's got all of these challenges I've just been talking about. So it's a transboundary basin, first of all. Pretty much all the water in the Saskatchewan River comes from the Rocky Mountains in Alberta. So it's a transboundary basin, and the 3 jurisdictions all have their different legal frameworks and different priorities and processes. It's an area which is experiencing a lot of stresses. So the South Saskatchewan, which is where most of the people live, is already fully allocated in southern Alberta. There's no more water to go around, and yet it's a rapidly evolving and developing economy. So there's some real challenges there. The land is changing rapidly. Of course, the prairies are totally different now from 100, 150 years ago, but even over the last 15 to 20 years, there have been very important changes in the way arable landscape is managed, and also the intensification of livestock rearing. So all of these are having their impacts, and then climate change is playing out, and I'll show you later. the implications of that. We have our pollution problems, and there are many issues of concern, including drinking water problems. We have lots of nutrients in our water. That means that when we put them through treatment processes and chlorinate them, we get carcinogenic byproducts, and many of the communities in the south of Saskatchewan have got levels of trihalomethane that exceed drinking water standards. So there are lots of issues around water quality. If many of you caught the report that was released last week by the Parliamentary Budget Office, looking at the future damage from flood and storms, and it's projecting that the federal government in Canada is going to be spending $1 billion a year on floods and droughts. That's very big money. So we're talking about $5 billion hit from drought in the turn of the century. We're talking about the Calgary floods, $6 billion. We're talking about $1 billion a year on extreme events. So there's very large sums of money, apart from the risks to lives and to livelihoods and to health. So we need various things. It's remarkable to me, coming to Canada from outside, that we don't have national flood forecasting. Probably the only developed country that I know of that doesn't. And that's symptomatic of the governance challenge. So federal government does not take strong responsibilities for managing water. The responsibilities lie with the provinces, and they have mixed levels of capability. And why shouldn't they? Because they're small populations with small resources. Canada is the canary in the coal mine for global warming. So we are seeing some of the world's most rapid rates of warming. That gives us a great scientific opportunity, but it's an existential problem for Canada's communities. And there's constantly items in the news about the way the landscape is changing. Ice roads are melting. We've no longer got access to areas that we had before. We have less snow, more rain, different patterns of flooding, different patterns of flows. I mean, a remarkable incident over a year ago where we went from incredibly wet conditions in Alberta into a spring drought, just like that. And one of the big drivers for that was the fact that we had such warm temperatures. So these changes we need to get to grips with. We are stuck in the early part of the 20th century when it comes to communicating water risks to people, communities, industries, agriculture. So we need to do so much more on information systems targeted to people's needs. There's a lot that we can do with smarter technologies. So we've got these challenges of limited water. Well, we can reuse water. We've got these challenges of water quality. Well, we can do a much smarter job at the way in which we use agricultural chemicals, which saves money for the farmers and has benefits for the environment. There's lots of challenges around particular issues of drinking water treatment, particularly for rural communities where investment is a challenge. And then we've got this backdrop of sustainability goals driving industry with respect to their markets. And that's a very confused and confusing story. And then, above all, we've got to do a better job at managing risks for our water futures. So we can manage better the risks of floods. We need flood forecasting. We need much better risk assessment. We need to put floodplain mapping up into the 21st century. We need to make people aware of the flood risk that they're living with.
The program on water governance, we do work around the world. We actually are doing work on 4 continents right now with partners everywhere from Europe to Asia to Latin America. But one of the truths about water issues is that they're global in scale, but they're often locally expressed. So the story I'm about to tell you about northeastern British Columbia really embodies a lot of the more general points about the water security challenges that we are facing today. So to introduce you to this part of Canada, northeastern British Columbia, the Peace River Valley, let's get a show of hands. How many people have been up to this part of British Columbia? So a few, okay, not that many. So I will spend a little time describing it. As you can see, it's at the uppermost edge of the Western Canadian Sedimentary Basin, so one of the large-scale deposits for shale gas, lots of energy extracted activity in this area, and it butts up against one of the world's most important intact forest landscapes. There are only 3 very large intact forest landscapes left in the world. So South American Amazon, Russia's Siberia, and the Canadian Boreal. So the area that we work in on this particular project has incredibly high biodiversity values, but also an incredibly rapid pace of energy extractive development. Now that's been going on for a few decades. So this is a photo of the Bennett Dam, built in the late 1960s, created North America's 3rd largest artificial lake, one of the largest earth-filled dams in the world, and a very significant source of hydroelectricity for the province. So much of the electricity that's powering us at this conference actually comes from this part of northeastern BC. And this is on a very important river system. The Peace Athabasca Delta is one of the most important inland water deltas in the world, largest in North America, UNESCO World Heritage Site. Not far from the dam, hydraulic fracturing activity. In fact, they're drawing water directly from Williston Lake to engage in hydraulic fracturing. And not far from that, one of Canada's earliest, and I believe still British Columbia's largest wind farm project. Also in this area, the source of major proposed LNG projects and pipelines. And so I'll stop there, but I think you already get the sense of what Howard was talking about the water nexus. Here we have, in one region, which is one of northern Canada's most important food producing regions, intense competition between water for energy, water for food, water for drinking, water for nature. So this is occurring in a context of extremely high rates of water use in some parts of a water scarce region. I don't want to overplay this. Canada has abundant water in general, although you probably will be surprised to know the actual numbers. We have about 6.7% of the world's annual renewable fresh water. That's about equivalent in proportion to our land mass. And much of that water flows north, far away from centers of population. So when you get the development of water extractive activity, as that graphic shows really well, over the course of decades, you begin to run up against fairly significant, albeit localized, water scarcity issues. The other thing to note that about this region and about Canada in general is that attempts to address the water energy nexus are taking place in the context of fairly intensively used landscapes. So this is an image of the southern foothills in Alberta. It's precisely the region that Howard was talking about in some of his slides, up against the mountains. And when you start to consider cultivated land, settlements, roads and railroads, feedlots, wind turbines, oil and gas wells, pipelines, water wells, power lines, cut lines, this is the fragmentation of the landscape that has very significant effects, cumulative effects, on hydrology. And this cumulative impacts issue is not adequately addressed in, actually, to be fair, most regulation around the world, not just in Canada. Although, given our system of really decentralized federalism, we are particularly bad at addressing this issue, but I won't pretend that other jurisdictions are fantastic. So when I say the north, I'm thinking Arctic Basin. So pretty big, but we're starting small. We're starting with a couple of communities in northeastern British Columbia where we've been working for the past couple of years. And our team does things like goes out and runs water bush camps. So at these camps, we bring together water scientists, we bring together lawyers, social scientists, all practicing academics, and we bring them together with Indigenous communities, representatives of industry, and we spend time developing methodologies to monitor water and to make that information available to the extent that we can in real time in order to improve water decision making. So a lot of you in this room probably work on water issues, and even if you don't, it's probably not going to come as a surprise that a lot of water decision making, especially with respect to water quality issues, is post hoc. So there's a pollution incident, we find out about it, we might litigate or penalize. So the regulatory system is post hoc. So we like to think of what we're doing as sort of upstream preventive medicine in designing, if you like, early warning systems for water quality incidents that get ahead of the curve. So here's a short video from the camp, and I'm hoping that the audio is up. Yeah? Great. So this will give you a flavor of the sorts of things we do.
When it comes to water, almost all cultures globally recognize that water is life, and it's not a mere commodity. It's to be venerated, it's to be honored, it's to be treated with the utmost respect.
The spark for this project and its genesis came about through realizing that traditional ways of conducting research on water weren't working. We have a lot of great expertise in different disciplines. They rarely speak to one another. There's a lot of great expertise in communities. They rarely interact with academics. All of this knowledge is really urgently needed in Indigenous communities.
When you're in the Bennett territory, science gotta fit in to the culture. What we share is used in a way that it helps science, but also that their science also helps us.
This method of connecting people has worked on this territory for millennia. We meet on the land. The people who are here will never forget this place. They will always remember it in any of their work. This place will now be relevant to them.
We had Indigenous community members and knowledge keepers, water scientists, lawyers. We had representatives of industry. Rare to get that kind of diversity of people in the same place at the same time, and that was really transformative.
That's a profound evolution in social science, the toolbox, because now these people are tied to this place and they're invested in this place.
That was even further deepened, I think, by shared experiences on the land, spending time on the water, being here in this beautiful place, realizing that although we come from very different backgrounds, we share a common concern and love for the environment, and that there are ways to work together.
A space where epiphany happens, moment by moment. That's the kind of space that inspires the kinds of change this world needs. That's the kind of space that inspires and contributes to the analysis that the social sciences need to offer at a time like this and issues like these.
The first question that we feel is very, very important for actors in industry, in government, to address is the viability of community-run water monitoring systems. These have existed for decades, but what's changed recently is the availability of low-cost sensors, cheap cloud-based computing, and a new familiarity with devices like this that all the people in these communities have access to and are very familiar with. So, for example, we're working together with the Gordon Foundation on this particular project. They're an amazing foundation based here in Canada, one of the leaders on water issues in the country, and they've developed a scalable water monitoring and information system that's designed for community members to input data and to pool data across watersheds and beyond, addressing some of the key issues that many jurisdictions, not just Canada, have with transboundary watersheds. So we're working with them to ground truth and scale that environmental monitoring and information system. And of course, you can think about this on a global scale. I mean, many of you might be aware of the amazing advances that are being made in technology right now for innovative environmental sensing. There's lots of examples I'd love to share, but this is just one. This is a Fitbit for the oceans. So this little device crawls around the oceans and gets everything from temperature to currents and salinity. So we are on the verge of wiring the oceans, and we'll have unprecedented access to real-time data about the health of the oceans. And we're doing analogous things for freshwater, actually for lots of environmental goods and services. My favorite is someone has invented a backpack for honeybees that carries a little sensor that helps really to try and assess some of the causes of extirpation of honeybees. So you get the point. Lots of amazing technology out there, relatively cheap. It's like an Internet of Things applied to the environment. So you can think about a kind of wired Gaia or digital Gaia idea that is now not only possible, but actually affordable.
My name is Lindsay Bass, and I lead corporate water stewardship for World Wildlife Fund US. And I'm going to be talking a little bit today about the role of the private sector in delivering innovation and solutions to some of these water security challenges that we've been talking about. I want to thank Karen and Howard for setting the stage for the corporate role in this and really teeing up some of the big challenges that we face. And before I dive in, I just want to give a brief overview of WWF for those of you out there that might not be familiar with us. We are one of the world's largest international environmental conservation organizations. We have offices in over 100 countries around the world, on 5 continents. We're well represented here in North America. We've got an outstanding Canada program with a strong freshwater team in the United States and then as well as in Mexico. But we've been around for a long time. We've been around for about 55 years. And we're known traditionally as a species conservation, habitat preservation, environmental organization. And that's certainly how we began. But as we have worked to help fulfill our mission, which is to create a planet where people live in harmony with nature, we've had to really change the way that we think about conservation and how we do our work. That started with really engaging communities and governments in our efforts to protect species and places. And in the early 2000s, we really had a watershed moment where when we looked at the major driving threats on the hotspot areas of biodiversity around the world that we were trying to protect, we found that one of the big drivers was private sector investment. And it was something that we had kind of left out of our puzzle. And so we really began to take a look at that and figure out, how could we begin to leverage the private sector not only for investment, but for their creativity, their innovation, and their influence as well. And so that's what I'm going to focus on today, is talking a little bit more about why the private sector is interested in water security and how they're beginning to act in terms of water stewardship, and telling a little bit about how we're helping them to take more impactful steps in their journeys to become better water stewards, and then talk a little bit about what that unleashes when we're able to get them to a point where they're realizing their full potential as water stewards. These are big companies with very, very complex operations, very complex supply chains and value chains. And so for them, sometimes the hardest thing is just figuring out, how do we get started? Where do we start? And so generally we see this maturity continuum for the private sector, where they start without a strategy, then they get their own house in order, which is all about efficiency. And then they start looking at, okay, well now I'm doing good within my own fence line, but what's going on in this larger pond that I sit within that we like to call a basin or a watershed? And they begin to look at those risks that are potentially going to impact their business. And when they really start to understand those risks, it begins to unlock innovation opportunities. And that's when companies that are looking at the true value of water, not just the price they pay for it, but the cost of moving it around, the cost of to treat it, the inputs that go into it, they begin to really understand how to make a stronger business case for doing more with less, and to find and work with communities to drive solutions beyond the fence line. And that's really when we begin to see great value generated through water stewardship. That's the brass ring that we're shooting for. So WWF works with companies to help move them through this maturity continuum quickly as possible. For us, it's about helping them to understand how to take right actions in right places, first and foremost. And so one of the tools that we use is the one up on the screen right now. It's WWF's water risk filter. There is a small set of water risk tools that are used by the private sector, as well as investors and other stakeholders, to begin to get a sense of where risk sits within their portfolios. So this is a great way for a business to begin to understand, where are their risk hotspots, and what is the nature of the risk in that area? Is it stemming from scarcity? Is it stemming from quality issues? Or is it stemming from a big exposure to climate change? From that, they're able to then understand what are some of the mitigation actions I can take to address those risks. And these tools are incredibly successful with the private sector. This tool alone has been online for about 4 years, and I believe at last check, about 120,000 facilities have been assessed and run through the water risk filter. So it's also a great opportunity for companies to understand where there's clusters of operations and big arenas of revenue that might be at risk, or capital investment that might be at risk. So it gives them a sense of where to focus and what to focus on. So once they have that sense of, where are the big issues, where are the geographies that are of critical importance to my business, one of the big challenges that a lot of big companies struggle with is how to take a big global strategy around water and ground it for their local operations and their suppliers. And so one tool that we use to help them accomplish this is the AWS, the Alliance for Water Stewardship Standard, and their framework. This is the world's first international water stewardship standard. It was released a few years ago. Although companies can pursue site-level certification through the standard, we like to just use it as a framework initially with companies. As they identify these critical water risky areas, this is a great tool to use with sites and operations that are in those areas to get them thinking about how are they measuring up? Are they doing what the world wants them to do in the realm of water stewardship? So there's some really clear steps, some key criteria attached to each step, and it gives sites an opportunity to say, okay, this is what I can get credit for, this is what I'm doing well. And it also helps identify, here are the gaps, these are the things that are blind spots for us. How can we begin to address those? And one of the things that is coming out of a lot of the piloting work that we're doing around this, and we've done some really, really interesting work in the Central Valley with some big brands, Olam and Diageo, on some food processing and wineries in the Central Valley of California. That's ground zero for California drought. This is an area that is experiencing incredible amount of risk. And what we're finding is that the standard is really helping sites empower their local people to take control and to begin to really drive the implementation of water stewardship on the ground. The other big takeaway is that it's really beginning to drive awareness about thinking beyond the fence line. So not just thinking about what you can do on site, but how important it is to reach out and engage with other stakeholders that are sharing those water resources with you. And that is a big watershed moment for both sites and big companies. When they finally get that, that really unleashes and unlocks a lot of potential and opportunity.